No, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. Believe me. Please, you have to believe me.
If I told you that one of the richest men in America once slept in the back of a delivery van with nothing but a torn backpack, a cracked phone, and a dream no one believed in, you probably wouldn't believe me. If I told you that the woman who loved him watched him being dragged away in handcuffs, convinced he had betrayed everything he claimed to stand for, you might call it another heartbreaking love story. But what if I told you that the man everyone labeled a thief would one day return holding the fate of an entire billion-dollar empire in his hands? What if the same family that refused to let him through their front gate would eventually wait outside his office, hoping for 5 minutes of his time? Sometimes the greatest fortunes are not inherited. Sometimes they are built from rejection, humiliation, and nights so painful that giving up feels easier than taking another step forward. And sometimes the people who celebrate your downfall unknowingly become the architects of your greatest victory. Every city has people who are seen without ever truly being noticed. They pass by expensive cars at red lights, carry packages to luxury penthouses, hold doors open for strangers, and disappear before anyone remembers their faces. To most people, they are simply workers doing another ordinary job. But every once in a while, hidden beneath a faded uniform is someone carrying a destiny far greater than anyone could imagine. This is the story of a young delivery driver whose greatest wealth wasn't the money in his pocket, because he had almost none. It wasn't the clothes on his back, because they were worn from years of hard work. His greatest wealth was something no one could measure, and it would eventually become the one thing that money, power, and influence could never buy back once it was lost. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Cole Bennett, and if you had met him on an ordinary Tuesday morning, you probably would have walked right past him without giving him a second glance. At 28 years old, Cole spent his days weaving through crowded city streets in a weathered delivery van, bringing expensive meals and important packages to people whose watches often cost more than everything he owned. Rain soaked his uniform more times than he could count. Summer heat left him exhausted before noon. Winter winds froze his hands as he hurried from one doorstep to another. Yet somehow, he greeted every customer with the same quiet smile. Not because life had been kind to him, but because he refused to let hardship decide the kind of man he would become. Few people knew that after every shift ended, Cole stayed awake for hours studying finance, global markets, and business strategy through borrowed books and free online courses, believing that knowledge could carry him somewhere his circumstances never had. Across the city, beyond glass towers that reflected the sunrise like walls of gold, lived a woman whose life appeared perfect from the outside. Sophie Whitmore was the brilliant daughter of the Whitmore family, founders of one of America's most respected real estate companies. Newspapers admired her intelligence. Business magazines praised her leadership. Investors trusted her judgment. Employees respected the compassion she showed inside an industry often driven only by numbers. Yet, behind every polished photograph was a woman quietly suffocating beneath expectations she never chose. Her future had already been planned, long before she was old enough to understand it, including an engagement to a wealthy businessman whose smile convinced the world he was charming while hiding ambitions that would stop at nothing to protect his own interests. Sophie had everything people spend their lives chasing, yet every morning she woke with the unsettling feeling that the most important part of her life had never truly belonged to her. Neither Cole nor Sophie could have imagined that a single unexpected encounter would set into motion a chain of events that would destroy reputations, expose carefully hidden lies, separate two hearts across continents, and eventually force an entire empire to confront the one man it had once discarded without mercy. Because sometimes the person standing quietly at the door isn't arriving to deliver a package. Sometimes they're delivering a future no one sees coming until it's too late. The truth was, Cole Bennett had been fighting battles long before he ever put on a delivery uniform. He grew up in a forgotten neighborhood on the edge of Chicago, where abandoned buildings stood like reminders of promises that had never been kept, and where opportunity often felt like something reserved for people living on the other side of the city. His father, Marcus Bennett, had worked as a city bus mechanic until a serious workplace accident left him unable to continue. Medical bills swallowed what little savings the family had, and within a few years, illness claimed his life. Cole was only 16 when he stood beside his father's grave, making a silent promise that he would take care of his mother, no matter how impossible that promise seemed. His mother, Denise Bennett, worked double shifts, cleaning office buildings downtown, returning home each night with aching feet, but still finding the strength to encourage her son not to let hardship harden his heart. She reminded him that dignity was something no one could steal unless he willingly surrendered it. Those words stayed with Cole long after she passed away from a sudden illness 2 years later, leaving him completely alone before he had even reached adulthood. Many people expected grief to break him, but instead, it became the quiet force that pushed him forward. Every job he accepted, every hour he worked, and every sacrifice he made carried the memory of the parents who had given everything they had, even when it wasn't enough. Life never became easier. Cole stocked grocery shelves through the night, washed dishes in restaurants before sunrise, unloaded delivery trucks during weekends, and eventually found steady work driving for one of Chicago's busiest premium delivery services. The paycheck barely covered rent for his tiny apartment, but it offered something he valued even more than money: time. Between deliveries, he listened to business podcasts, borrowed books from the public library, and filled old notebooks with observations about successful companies, investment strategies, and leadership. While other drivers spent breaks scrolling through social media, Cole studied annual reports from Fortune 500 companies as though they were novels. His coworkers laughed, joking that a delivery driver had no reason to read financial statements. Cole simply smiled and returned to his notes. He wasn't studying because he believed success would arrive overnight. He studied because he refused to let his current address become his permanent destination. Deep inside, he believed that preparation had a strange way of meeting opportunity when the timing was right, even if nobody else could see it yet. Meanwhile, Sophie Whitmore's world looked glamorous enough to fill magazine covers, yet the closer someone stood to her life, the easier it became to notice the invisible weight she carried. As executive vice president of Whitmore Holdings, she had transformed struggling neighborhoods into thriving communities and earned genuine admiration from employees who believed she cared more about people than profits. Her father often described her as the future of the company. But every compliment came with another expectation, another board meeting, another reminder that the Whitmore name mattered more than personal happiness. Standing beside her at every gala and corporate event was her fiancé, Damien Cross, a polished entrepreneur whose confidence impressed investors and whose carefully crafted public image convinced almost everyone that he was the perfect partner. Few realized that Damien measured people by their usefulness, believing kindness was a weakness, and loyalty something to be purchased rather than earned. His engagement to Sophie was less about love than about securing influence over Whitmore Holdings, a goal he pursued with remarkable patience, while hiding his true intentions behind expensive suits and practiced smiles. Fate finally placed Cole and Sophie on the same path during what should have been one of the most ordinary deliveries of Cole's career. A major board meeting at Whitmore Holdings had stretched well into the afternoon, and a last-minute catering order was placed for dozens of executives. Cole loaded the meals into his van, checked every receipt twice, and arrived at the towering headquarters just as heavy rain began to fall across the city. While assistants hurried through the lobby balancing laptops and paperwork, Cole carefully carried tray after tray toward the executive conference floor, determined not to damage a single order despite the slippery marble floors. Most executives walked past him without making eye contact, treating him as part of the building itself. Sophie, however, noticed something different. As she stepped out of the elevator, she saw Cole quietly kneel to help an elderly janitor gather cleaning supplies that had spilled across the hallway after someone bumped into her cart. No cameras were watching. No supervisors were nearby. There was nothing to gain from stopping to help. Yet Cole smiled, picked up every bottle and cloth, and wished the woman a wonderful afternoon before returning to his deliveries, as though kindness required no audience. Sophie found herself watching him longer than she intended, surprised that such a simple act stood out more than every polished presentation she had listened to that day. Their paths crossed again, only moments later, when one of the catering trays slipped from a temporary cart after another employee rushed around the corner. Cole reacted instantly, catching most of the expensive meal before it crashed onto the polished floor, though hot coffee splashed across his sleeve in the process. Instead of blaming the employee or complaining about the burn spreading across his arm, he calmly apologized for the delay, replaced the damaged items from spare containers in his van, and completed the delivery without asking for sympathy. Sophie, who had witnessed everything from a distance, couldn't understand how someone under constant pressure managed to remain so composed. She thanked Cole personally before he left, offering to have the company's medical team examine his arm, but he politely declined, saying there were still customers waiting for deliveries, and he couldn't afford to disappoint them. It was a brief conversation lasting barely 2 minutes, yet something about his humility lingered in Sophie's thoughts long after the elevators closed behind him. For Cole, it was simply another workday, another delivery, another customer among hundreds. He had no reason to believe the elegant executive who thanked him would ever remember his name, but Sophie did remember. Over the following weeks, she found herself wondering about the young man whose quiet character seemed untouched by bitterness despite carrying the unmistakable marks of hardship. In a city where everyone appeared desperate to prove their importance, Cole had done the opposite. He had expected nothing, demanded nothing, and still managed to leave a lasting impression. Neither of them realized that someone else had also noticed their brief encounter. Watching discreetly from the conference room window, Damien Cross saw the exchange, dismissed it as meaningless, and returned to his meeting. At least, that was what he wanted everyone to believe. In reality, a small seed of suspicion had already taken root in his mind, and before long, it would grow into a decision that would change all of their lives forever. Sophie tried to convince herself that Cole Bennett was simply another hardworking man she happened to meet during a busy afternoon at Whitmore Holdings, but the memory of him refused to fade. Over the next several weeks, their paths crossed more often than either of them expected. Sometimes, Cole delivered confidential documents between Whitmore's offices. Other times, he arrived with catering for late-night strategy meetings that stretched long after sunset. Every encounter lasted only a few minutes, yet those brief moments revealed more about Cole's character than years of polished conversations ever could. He never tried to impress anyone. He never asked for favors or attention. He simply treated every person with the same quiet respect, whether they were a security guard opening the lobby doors or a senior executive stepping out of a luxury car. Sophie found herself delaying her walk back to the boardroom whenever she noticed the familiar delivery van outside the building. Their conversations remained simple, touching on books, the city, and the dreams people often abandoned because life demanded survival first. Cole never mentioned how difficult his own life had been. Instead, he spoke about possibilities, believing that every setback carried a lesson if someone was willing to learn from it. That outlook fascinated Sophie because it was so different from the ambitious, image-conscious executives who surrounded her every day. Outside the polished walls of Whitmore Holdings, Cole's life remained a constant struggle. His apartment building was old enough to remember better days, with cracked staircases, unreliable heating, and neighbors working multiple jobs just to stay afloat. Even after paying rent, utilities, and fuel for his delivery routes, there were weeks when his refrigerator held little more than bread, eggs, and instant noodles. Yet every Friday evening, Cole volunteered at a neighborhood community center where struggling teenagers gathered after school. He taught them basic budgeting, encouraged them to finish high school, and reminded them that their circumstances did not have to define the rest of their lives. Many of those teenagers looked up to him because he never pretended to have all the answers. He simply showed up every week, proving through his consistency that someone believed in them. Sophie unexpectedly witnessed one of those evenings after visiting a local housing project funded by Whitmore Holdings. Watching Cole patiently help a young boy complete a college scholarship application changed something inside her. She realized his kindness wasn't something he switched on when people were watching. It was simply who he was. The more Sophie learned about Cole, the harder it became to ignore the growing distance between herself and Damien Cross. Damien excelled at making generous public donations whenever cameras were present, but behind closed doors, he measured success only through financial gain and influence. He frequently dismissed employees whose performance briefly declined because of family emergencies or health problems, arguing that emotions had no place in business. Sophie challenged those decisions whenever she could, believing a company became stronger when it valued its people. Their disagreements grew more frequent, though Damien always managed to smooth things over in front of the Whitmore family. To everyone else, they remained the perfect power couple, preparing for a lavish wedding. Only Sophie understood that every conversation with Damien felt more like a business negotiation than a relationship built on trust. Then she would think about Cole, whose quiet sincerity required no performance, and the contrast became impossible to ignore. Damien wasn't blind to the changes. He noticed Sophie smiling after checking her phone whenever Cole sent a polite message confirming an important delivery. He noticed her asking reception to ensure the same driver handled Whitmore's urgent assignments because she trusted his professionalism. Most of all, he noticed that she spoke about Cole with the respect she no longer showed him. Damien hired a private investigator, expecting to uncover a criminal record, hidden debts, or anything that could explain why an ordinary delivery driver had earned Sophie's attention. Instead, the report frustrated him. Cole's background revealed nothing but years of relentless work, excellent employment records, volunteer service, and unpaid student loans from a college education he had been forced to abandon after his parents died. There were no scandals, no arrests, no reckless behavior. For Damien, that was almost worse. A man with integrity was far more dangerous than a man with obvious flaws, because integrity couldn't easily be bought or manipulated. One crisp autumn evening, fate offered Cole and Sophie their longest conversation yet. Sophie's car broke down a few blocks from Whitmore Holdings after another exhausting day of meetings. As she stood on the sidewalk trying unsuccessfully to contact roadside assistance, Cole happened to drive past on his final delivery of the evening. Recognizing her immediately, he pulled over and offered to help. Together they waited nearly an hour for the tow truck, talking as the city lights reflected off rain-soaked streets and the evening traffic slowly faded into the distance. Sophie spoke about the pressure of carrying her family's legacy, while Cole admitted that his greatest fear wasn't remaining poor, but reaching the end of his life, wondering whether he had wasted the potential his parents believed he possessed. There was no attempt to impress one another. Two people from completely different worlds simply shared honest thoughts they rarely voiced to anyone else. For the first time in years, Sophie laughed without worrying about appearances, while Cole forgot, if only briefly, the endless responsibilities waiting for him the next morning. From across the street, another pair of eyes watched the entire exchange. Damien had just left a private dinner with investors when he recognized Sophie's car parked beside Cole's delivery van. He remained inside his vehicle long enough to see them smiling together beneath the streetlights. Although nothing inappropriate happened, Damien no longer cared about the truth. In his mind, the delivery driver had crossed an invisible line. Cole Bennett was no longer an ordinary worker, making scheduled deliveries to Whitmore Holdings. He had become an obstacle, standing between Damien and the future he intended to control. As Damien quietly drove away into the night, he made a decision that would set an irreversible chain of events into motion. Cole had no idea that the most difficult chapter of his life had already begun, and the woman who had unknowingly brought hope back into his heart would soon become the very reason everything he had worked for came crashing down. Damien Cross understood something that many powerful people eventually learn. Destroying a person's reputation is often easier than defeating them honestly. The more he watched Sophie's admiration for Cole grow, the more convinced he became that the delivery driver had to disappear before their friendship became something deeper. Damien knew he couldn't simply have Cole fired. Sophie would ask questions. Instead, he began creating a trap that would leave Cole with no way to defend himself. Through one of his longtime associates, Damien arranged for several confidential company documents and a collection of valuable antique watches, recently purchased for an executive charity auction, to be moved through a Whitmore Holdings warehouse on a day when Cole's delivery route would place him there. It looked like an ordinary business transaction, but every detail had been carefully planned weeks in advance. That afternoon began like any other for Cole. He scanned his deliveries, greeted the warehouse staff, and signed the necessary paperwork before loading several sealed packages into his van. Just as he prepared to leave, security alarms suddenly echoed throughout the building. Within seconds, guards rushed toward the loading dock, while employees stood frozen in confusion. Warehouse managers quickly discovered that the antique watches and several confidential files had vanished. Before anyone had time to understand what was happening, security officers surrounded Cole's van and ordered him to step out. Hidden beneath one of the delivery containers were the missing watches, along with copies of the stolen documents. Cole stared at them in complete disbelief. He knew he had never seen those items before, but every piece of evidence now pointed directly at him. Sophie arrived moments later after receiving an urgent phone call from the warehouse. She pushed through the crowd just in time to see Cole standing beside his van with handcuffs around his wrists. Their eyes met for only a few seconds. Cole wasn't pleading for sympathy or begging anyone to believe him. He simply looked stunned, trying to understand how his ordinary workday had turned into a nightmare. Sophie instinctively stepped forward, insisting there had to be some mistake, but Damien calmly placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, reminding everyone that evidence could not be ignored simply because someone appeared honest. His composed reaction made him seem reasonable, while Cole's silence was mistaken for guilt. The police escorted Cole away as dozens of employees watched from the warehouse entrance, whispering to one another about the delivery driver they thought they knew. News spread across the city with shocking speed. Local media reported that a delivery driver had stolen valuable company property from one of Chicago's most respected corporations. Cole's employer terminated him before the investigation had even concluded. The community center where he volunteered suspended his mentorship program until the case was resolved. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now closed their doors when they saw him walking past. Everything he had spent years building disappeared in less than 48 hours. Sophie refused to accept that the man she had come to respect could commit such a crime. But every attempt she made to question the investigation was quietly dismissed. Damien encouraged her to let the legal process run its course, all while privately making sure no evidence capable of exposing the truth would ever reach the authorities. As Cole sat alone in a holding cell waiting for his first court appearance, he replayed every moment of that terrible afternoon again and again, searching for an explanation that never came. He had survived poverty, loss, and years of struggle without allowing bitterness to consume him. But this was different. For the first time in his life, honesty alone wasn't enough to save him. Someone had stolen far more than his freedom. They had stolen the one thing he had protected above everything else, his name. And although Cole couldn't yet see it, losing everything was about to become the first step toward a future no one, especially Damien Cross, could have imagined. The weeks that followed became the darkest period of Cole Bennett's life. Although his attorney eventually proved there wasn't enough evidence to convict him of organizing the theft, the court ruled that the circumstances surrounding the missing property were too suspicious to ignore. Cole avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but the damage had already been done. Every headline had already declared him guilty long before the verdict was announced. Future employers rejected his applications without explanation. Friends stopped returning his calls. Even strangers recognized his face from the news and quietly whispered as he passed by. In the space of a single month, Cole lost his job, his apartment, and the reputation he had spent years earning. One evening, carrying nothing more than a duffel bag, he stood outside the community center where he once volunteered. The doors were locked, and a small notice announced that a new mentor had replaced him. Cole looked through the glass for a few moments before turning away. It wasn't the building he was leaving behind. It was the life he had believed he would one day build. Sophie refused to believe the story was over. She spent weeks reviewing internal reports, questioning warehouse employees, and searching for inconsistencies that everyone else seemed willing to ignore. Small details began to trouble her. Security camera footage from one loading area had mysteriously disappeared. Inventory records had been altered shortly before the robbery. Several employees who worked that afternoon suddenly resigned within days of the investigation. Whenever Sophie raised those concerns, Damien always had a convenient explanation. He urged her to move forward, reminding her that the company needed stability after the embarrassing scandal. Yet the harder he pushed her to forget Cole, the more convinced Sophie became that someone wanted the truth to remain buried. She just couldn't prove it. With no family left to support him and no employer willing to give him another chance, Cole accepted the only opportunity that came his way. An elderly professor he had once helped during a delivery remembered Cole's passion for finance and introduced him to a former student who managed a growing logistics company in Singapore. The position wasn't glamorous. It paid just enough to survive, and relocating meant leaving behind the only country he had ever known. But staying in Chicago meant carrying a label that would follow him forever. A week later, Cole boarded a flight with a single suitcase, less than $500 in his bank account, and no guarantee that life would improve. As the plane lifted above the city skyline, he looked out the window one last time. He wasn't running away. He was giving himself one final chance to become the man his parents had always believed he could be. Life overseas tested Cole in ways he never expected. During the day, he worked tirelessly helping modernize the struggling logistics company. At night, he continued studying global investments, international trade, and emerging technology markets. His willingness to solve problems others ignored quickly earned the respect of senior executives. Within 2 years, he had helped transform the company into one of the fastest-growing firms in the region. Rather than spending his growing income on luxury, Cole quietly invested in overlooked businesses and commercial properties that larger investors had dismissed. His instincts proved remarkably accurate. One successful investment led to another, and before long, financial publications began mentioning a mysterious American investor whose companies consistently turned failing businesses into profitable enterprises. Very few people recognized the name Cole Bennett, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Back in Chicago, Whitmore Holdings faced a crisis no one saw coming. A series of risky acquisitions, approved under Damien's influence, began draining the company's finances. Construction projects stalled. Investors lost confidence. banks refused additional loans without major restructuring. For the first time in decades, the Whitmore empire stood on the edge of collapse. Sophie fought desperately to keep the company alive, unaware that somewhere across the world, the man everyone believed they had erased had quietly become one of the few people wealthy enough to save it. Fate was bringing their stories together once again, but this time, Cole Bennett would not be returning as a delivery driver carrying someone else's package. He would return carrying the future of an empire that had once turned its back on him. 5 years passed, and Chicago had almost forgotten the name Cole Bennett. The headlines that once destroyed his reputation had long disappeared, replaced by newer scandals and bigger stories. But inside the executive boardroom of Whitmore Holdings, a different name dominated every conversation. Financial analysts spoke of an investment group called Summit Crest Capital, a firm that had quietly rescued struggling companies across 3 continents without seeking publicity. Unlike other investors, Summit Crest Capital never rushed into failing businesses. It waited patiently until companies reached the edge of collapse, then negotiated from a position of overwhelming strength. No one knew much about the firm's founder because he rarely appeared in interviews or public events. That mystery only increased his influence. When Whitmore Holdings officially announced it needed outside investment to avoid bankruptcy, Summit Crest Capital became the only serious buyer capable of keeping the company alive. Sophie had spent months trying to save the family business, working 18-hour days while watching decades of hard work slowly crumble around her. Employees feared losing their jobs, longtime investors demanded answers, and creditors were running out of patience. Even Damien, who had confidently promised the board that his expansion strategy would create record profits, struggled to hide his growing panic. His risky decisions had pushed the company into a financial disaster, yet he still refused to accept responsibility. Instead, he insisted that securing a partnership with Summit Crest Capital was their only realistic option. Meetings were arranged, legal teams prepared documents, and everyone waited for the mysterious founder to arrive in Chicago. Rumors spread throughout the city. Some believed the investor was an aging billionaire from Europe. Others claimed it was a powerful technology entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. No one imagined the truth. On the morning of the meeting, luxury vehicles lined the entrance to Whitmore Holdings as reporters gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who could determine the company's future. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was filled with nervous anticipation. Damien rehearsed his presentation one final time, convinced he could persuade Summit Crest Capital's founder to support his leadership. Sophie sat quietly at the far end of the table, exhausted but determined to protect the employees who depended on the company. Then the conference room doors slowly opened. The room fell completely silent as a tall man in a perfectly tailored navy suit stepped inside, followed by a small team of advisors. His posture was calm. His expression carried quiet confidence rather than arrogance. Years of discipline had replaced the uncertainty that once shadowed his face. For several seconds, no one recognized him. Then Sophie looked into his eyes, and time seemed to stand still. It was Cole Bennett, the same delivery driver who had once entered this building carrying food containers, now returned carrying the future of the entire company. Shock spread across the room like a wave. Several executives exchanged confused glances, struggling to believe what they were seeing. Damien's face lost all color as memories of the warehouse, the police sirens, and the handcuffs rushed back into his mind. Cole acknowledged everyone with a polite nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. He spoke with quiet authority, explaining that Summit Crest Capital had completed months of research and believed Whitmore Holdings still possessed tremendous potential under the right leadership. His voice remained calm, professional, and completely free of bitterness. He never mentioned the past. He never reminded anyone how they had treated him. Somehow, That silence carried more weight than any accusation ever could. As the meeting continued, Cole demonstrated an extraordinary understanding of the company's financial problems, identifying weaknesses that even Whitmore's senior executives had overlooked. Within minutes, it became obvious that the young man they had once dismissed had become one of the most respected business minds in the industry. Sophie listened with a mixture of admiration and regret, wondering how different their lives might have been if someone had uncovered the truth years earlier. Damien, however, wasn't thinking about the future of the company. He was thinking about survival. If Cole ever discovered who had orchestrated the robbery, everything Damien had spent years building would collapse around him. For the first time since their lives crossed, Damien realized he was no longer the most powerful man in the room. The delivery driver he believed he had erased had returned as the one person capable of saving or destroying everything he valued. Although Cole Bennett had returned with enough power to take complete control of Whitmore Holdings, revenge was never the reason he came back. During the years he spent rebuilding his life, he had learned that success meant very little if it existed only to settle old scores. He wanted to invest in good businesses, protect honest employees, and prove that a person's past did not have to determine their future. Still, every time he walked through the halls of Whitmore Holdings, memories returned uninvited. He remembered carrying delivery boxes through those same corridors, greeting people who barely looked at him, and leaving each evening believing that hard work alone would eventually open doors. Now those same executives stood whenever he entered the room, carefully choosing every word they spoke. The change had nothing to do with respect. It had everything to do with power, and Cole understood the difference. Sophie Whitmore couldn't ignore the questions that had haunted her for 5 years. Cole's return reignited every doubt she had buried after the robbery. Determined to uncover the truth once and for all, she hired an independent forensic investigation team to review the original case from the beginning. Unlike the rushed internal inquiry years earlier, this team had complete access to archived financial records, deleted security logs, employee communications, and warehouse access data. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the company. Hidden among thousands of archived emails was evidence that several warehouse security schedules had been changed only hours before the robbery. More importantly, financial records revealed that 2 former warehouse employees had received unusually large payments through companies secretly connected to Damien Cross. One of those employees, now struggling with serious health problems, finally agreed to tell investigators what had really happened. He admitted that Damien had paid him to hide the antique watches inside Cole's delivery container moments before security alarms were triggered. Cole had never stolen anything. He had been selected because Damien believed no one would question the guilt of an ordinary delivery driver standing beside expensive stolen property. Sophie felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. Everything she had feared was true. The man she trusted, defended, and nearly married had destroyed an innocent life to protect his own ambitions. Without wasting another moment, she presented the evidence to the Whitmore board, law enforcement, and the company's legal advisors. Damien desperately denied every accusation, insisting the witnesses had been bribed and the investigation was politically motivated. But years of carefully hidden lies began collapsing one after another. Additional financial records surfaced. Secret phone calls were recovered. Former associates, realizing they could no longer protect him, began cooperating with investigators. The polished businessman who had spent years controlling every situation suddenly found himself standing alone. As federal agents entered the boardroom to place Damien under arrest, he turned toward Cole, expecting to see satisfaction on the face of the man he had wronged. Instead, Cole remained seated in complete silence. There was no smile, no celebration, and no insult. Damien had spent years believing power came from destroying others. In that moment, he finally understood that true strength belonged to the man who no longer needed revenge to prove he had won. News of Damien's arrest spread across the country almost as quickly as the original robbery accusation years earlier. This time, however, the headlines told a very different story. Cole Bennett was publicly cleared of every allegation. The city that had once judged him without hesitation now celebrated his extraordinary comeback. Whitmore Holdings officially apologized for its failures during the original investigation, and Cole accepted the apology with quiet humility, making it clear that his greatest concern had never been restoring his reputation alone. He wanted every employee, regardless of their position, to know they deserved fairness before judgment. Under a new partnership between Summit Crest Capital and Whitmore Holdings, thousands of jobs were saved, abandoned community projects resumed construction, and neighborhoods that had been left behind finally received the investment they had been promised years earlier. Sophie later asked Cole a question she had carried in her heart ever since the day he disappeared. She wondered whether he had ever hated her for believing the accusations, even if only for a moment. Cole admitted that the pain of losing her had been one of the hardest parts of his journey, but he also understood that she had been trapped inside a carefully planned deception. Holding onto anger would never have changed the past. Choosing forgiveness allowed both of them to move forward. Their relationship wasn't rebuilt overnight. Trust that had been broken by lies required patience, honesty, and time. Yet this time, it grew from something much stronger than admiration. It grew from two people who had both survived heartbreak, discovered the truth, and learned that love built on integrity can endure even the harshest storms. Years later, people often described Cole Bennett as one of the country's most successful investors, but those who truly knew him used a different title. They called him the Prince of the Streets, because he never forgot where his journey began. He continued visiting community centers, mentoring young entrepreneurs, funding scholarships, and quietly helping families facing the same struggles he once endured. Whenever someone asked him the secret behind his remarkable success, he rarely spoke about money or business. He simply smiled and said that life has a way of testing what cannot be measured by a bank account. Wealth can disappear overnight. Power can change hands. Reputation can be stolen by a single lie. But character, once protected through every hardship, becomes the one investment that continues paying dividends for the rest of a person's life. And perhaps that is why the poor delivery driver, who once left a towering office building in handcuffs, eventually returned through those same doors as the man who held its future in his hands, not because fate owed him anything, but because he never allowed injustice to change the kind of man he chose to become. If Cole's journey reminded you that your current circumstances don't define your future, then this story was for you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think you would have forgiven the people who destroyed your life? Or would you have chosen a different path? Share your answer in the comments below, because we read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember this: people can take away your job, your reputation, and even your opportunities, but they can never take away your character unless you choose to give it away. We'll see you in the next story.